I'm on a mission. History is too complicated, textbooks are way too big, and my MO is convenience. I strive to make history as convenient as possible, but an issue I face on the daily is that I only know how to talk about video games. Quite the oversight. But I'll make it work somehow.
Currently, there are 3 big console manufacturers, Sony with their PlayStation, Microsoft with their Xbox, and Nintendo with their Nintendo. Now, the interesting thing about these 3 is that they didn't make video game consoles at first. Just like before I started talking about video games, I reviewed soup.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Campbell's Soup Guy, and today we have another requested classic soup. This one is lentil soup. It expired about 3 years ago. Probably safe for consumption.
Let's just start right out with the most interesting company on this list, Nintendo. The story of how we got here is a pretty well-known one. Being established in 1889, Nintendo obviously hasn't been making video games their whole life, or maybe they have and we're just unaware of how good technology was back then. Nintendo started out as a card company making Hanafuda cards, which roughly translates to flower cards. The use of playing cards was outlawed in Japan because the government associated them with gambling. So gamblers got away with using Hanafuda cards because no way can these things be mistaken for real playing cards. For a while, that's almost all they did until Nintendo needed to find a new president when Sekiryo Yamauchi suffered a debilitating stroke. Back then, Nintendo was a family business. However, Sekiryo didn't have any sons, so he had to settle for his son-in-law Shikanojo, but he abandoned his family and never became president. Therefore, Sekiryo had to settle with his grandson, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who to this day holds the record for the longest sitting Nintendo president, holding reign from 1949 all the way to 2003. Yamauchi wasn't afraid of taking risks, and in 1959 did something that changed Nintendo entirely. They partnered up with Disney to make playing cards with Disney characters on them. You see, these couldn't be used for gambling devices. These cards have fucking Bambi on them, and that meant these were for kids. And that's the thing, this was the first instance of Nintendo being a family company.
Nintendo found a lot of success with their cards. I mean, families were able to play simple card games with their children due to the marketable nature of these cards, and Nintendo's next adventure would only be... What? Oh, come on, guys!
Yeah, even though their Disney cards did particularly well, they were doing a multitude of other things like instant rice, vacuum cleaners, and yeah, sex hotels. Nintendo was struggling in the early 60s. Playing cards were becoming an oversaturated market, and even though there was an economic boom in Japan due to the Olympics taking place, nobody was buying playing cards anymore. Hard time for Go Fish fans, let me tell you. On top of that, all their other ventures failed except making toys, but they were still struggling in that market too. A lot changed when Yamauchi was visiting one of the Hanafuda factories and noticed an extendable arm toy created by a lower maintenance engineer, Gunpei Yokoi. He thought it was so good, he wanted Yokoi to develop it as a full product for the holiday season, and it sold like crazy. Yokoi was soon pushed up to product development.
God, every day I grow more jealous of Gunpei Yokoi, because when I made a pretty bangin' burger at a fast food place, they didn't make me head chef, they asked me what the f*** I was doing behind the counter and kicked me out.
Nintendo after this became a toy company. They made toys like the 10 billion barrel puzzle, the Ultra Machine, which was a baseball pitching machine, and the Love Tester. They even made the Nintendo Beam Gun, which knowing Nintendo probably has that Nintendo charm all over it. After making hit toy after hit toy, Nintendo started to dabble in the arcade industry, which they kinda failed at making anything big at first. EVR Race, anyone? Monkey Magic? Fascination?
I'll get my coat.
Nintendo's first experience with the game industry was actually none other than the first ever video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. While they didn't make the system itself, they partnered with Magnavox to make the guns used for the Odyssey shooting range peripheral. But in 1977, Nintendo created the Color TV game series of systems, essentially just their version of a Pong console, and the eventual success of the Game & Watch series of handhelds would lead Nintendo down the path of going solely into video games. And ever since, Nintendo has been only making video games, but Nintendo's case is certainly interesting as they're the only company here that didn't start in the electronics business whatsoever, such as Sony. Sony was founded in 1946 by Masaru Ibuka and Akio Morita as Tokyo Seijin Kogyo, or Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation in English. Yeah, I'm not gonna say all that, so let's just call them Sony, because 12 years after the company's founding, they would change their name to that. Sony built Japan's first tape recorder, the Type G, and the first product with the Sony branding on it was the TR-55, which was the first transistor radio in Japan. Sony was brought over to America in 1960, and when the TR-63 was brought over to America, it launched the industry of consumer microelectronics over here. In 1968, Sony launched the Trinitron TV, which was the reason why Sony became the world's largest TV manufacturer until 2006. Sony had the firsts with a lot of things. First stereo cassette player with the Walkman, first CD player, and the first portable CD player, alongside a ton of failed storage formats like Betamax, minidiscs, and UMDs, which were only used on the PlayStation Portable.
At least these things let me watch Open Season on the go.
Now, until 1991, Sony wasn't really directly involved with the game industry. However, as early as 1988, Sony was working with Nintendo to create a CD-ROM version of the Super Nintendo. They revealed it in June of 1991 at the Consumer Electronics Show, and then a day later, Nintendo canceled the project as they weren't quite sure how the revenue would be split between them and Sony. Sony went,
"You know what? Fine! I'll just make my own console. I don't need you guys anyway."
And they sure did. I wonder how that worked out for them. Oh, that actually worked out pretty well, didn't it? In fact, the PlayStation was the name of the CD-based Super Nintendo. Ever since then, Sony has been pretty successful with the PlayStation, and some may argue it's the only thing keeping them afloat. Now, the most direct competitor with Sony is Microsoft. I mean, the original Xbox was made because Microsoft saw the recently revealed PS2 as a threat to the personal computer.
People will say Sony's biggest competitor is Nintendo, but that's all because Sony still holds grudges and hates Nintendo's guts for what they did to them almost 30 years ago.
Microsoft started in 1975 by programmers Paul Allen and Bill Gates. They did a bunch of nerd shit I'm sure you Mountain Dew guzzling gamers wouldn't care about, like developing an operating system for IBM's first personal computer, buying the rights to the DOS operating system, releasing Microsoft Flight Simulator, and creating Microsoft Windows.
You know, nerd stuff. Nothing that you guys would be interested in. How about some Sega PC Puzzle Pack to calm your nerves?
You know, speaking of PCs, gotcha bitch, we're still talking about Microsoft. They've actually been kinda close with PC gaming for decades. I'd say around the release of Doom was when they got serious about the game industry. They made an official port of Doom to Windows 95 computers, which was actually initially started by one they called Gabe Newell, who later went to co-found Valve Software. Microsoft realized that with the game's popularity, they could buy id Software. They ended up not doing that. Until 28 years later, Microsoft repurposed the port into a promotion of the upcoming Windows 95 as a gaming platform. They announced the port with a presentation of Bill Gates superimposed into E1M2 killing zombies with a shotgun that he's holding wrong.
Yeah. Don't interrupt me.
Shit, Bill, that was badass.
The port was actually made as a flagship for Microsoft's DirectX technology. That's important, it's gonna come up again later. And that later is now. 3 years after the port's release in 1999, Sony announced the PlayStation 2. You see, the PS2 was flaunting its cock all over the place. This thing could play CDs, DVDs, access the internet, and had some pretty sleek games coming out. Microsoft saw the PS2 as a threat to the personal computer, and so did Sony themselves, who had a vision that consoles would completely replace PCs.
Alright, time to do my taxes.
The same year the PS2 was announced, though, had the American release of the Sega Dreamcast, which ran a custom version of Windows CE, so Microsoft had already dipped their toes into the console market. And when Microsoft decided to get into the console market, that approach is what they decided to do, essentially make a console with similar hardware to a PC. That made it wicked easy for developers to make games for Xbox, as the system ran a version of Windows and DirectX. Yep, DirectX was the inspiration for the name of the whole brand. In fact, one of the names tossed around during development was the DirectX box. They chose the name Xbox after thinking it would be the least favored name during testing, yet it was the most popular one.
And ever since, Microsoft has been making consoles. As you can see, I'm a fan.
Going back to Sega, they've always been making video games. I mean, the name literally stands for service games. Oh man, I think they made soup. Alright, if you say so. They're also the only company here who doesn't make consoles anymore. Sega started all the way back as Standard Games in 1940. Founded in Honolulu, Hawaii, the company was made to distribute coin-op machines to military bases. In 1945, they established a second distributor called California Games, and immediately dissolved Standard Games. Then California Games was dissolved a year later after the company Service Games was founded. We'll just call them Sega from now on. While they still distributed machines to military bases, slot machines in the US were outlawed in 1951, so 2 Sega employees were sent to Japan to form Sega of Japan, which would be dissolved a decade later due to the company being banned in US air bases in Japan and the Philippines. Founders Irving Bromberg and Marty Bromley would eventually sell the company in 1961 to the companies Nihon Guraku Busan and Nihon Kekai Seizo, who the latter was already doing business as Sega Inc. So boom, there, okay. Sega by this point is officially a Japanese company, and in 1965, Guraku Busan acquired the company Rosen Enterprises and formed Sega Enterprises. Sega decided to pull up their big boy pants and went from distributor to manufacturer, releasing Periscope in 1965. They exported it to Europe and the United States, and it was the first American arcade game to cost 25 cents to play. Sega was surprised by the success of Periscope and decided to crank out 8 to 10 games a year. The 70s were a booming time for Sega, as their arcade games became mega popular. They opened up huge arcades in Sapporo and Nagasaki, took over control of a bunch of arcades in California, made a knockoff Chuck E. Cheese. Sure.
Sega would eventually make the SG-1000 after an arcade industry declined, because you can't live off of Congo Bongo alone.
There's other companies like Atari, but they were made as a video game company and released their first console like 3 years after they were founded. There's barely a before consoles with them, and other companies who've made consoles died too quickly to really care much about them. It is a little interesting to see where these companies got their start though. So, I hope I was able to break the history of these different companies down into a form that was easy to digest and extremely convenient.
Because at the end of the day, I'm a huge supporter of the convenience movement, and I'm so glad a lot of other people are jumping on the train too. Like, credit card companies are putting all the info on the back, so if I want to leak my credit card on Twitter, I only need to take one picture instead of two. It's genius.